Hey there, everybody. Welcome to Latter-day Struggles. This is your host, Valerie, and I am really grateful, as usual, to be with you today for yet another podcast conversation about how we can become more psychologically and spiritually whole as members of or somehow connected to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So today, I am going to jump into some fantastic content that I take no credit for. I will, of course, go ahead and talk about some of my thoughts and feelings as I go. But I today am once again going to stand on the shoulders of a great scholar. Today, we're going to be looking through and talking about a booklet that I ran across that is written by someone who I am just gaining more and more and more respect for all of the time. You might recognize the name Gregory Prince. If you don't, that's okay. He is also, coincidentally, at least for me, he is someone who was a key player in the Latter-day Saint Faith Crisis Report that we have just been going into in some detail on this podcast. So as promised, I wanted to address some of the questions and some of the concerns that many of us have that have been at least contributing factors to faith and trust crisis here in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that have to do with a lot of the social issues that our church is struggling with. In particular, last episode, I talked with Kate Gregory from In Her Image about some issues around gender, power, and patriarchy. And specifically, we integrated how fear of an idea of the feminine divine plays into a lot of our current struggles with faith and trust in our institution. Today, I'm going to go in a slightly different direction. We're still talking about power. We're still talking about gender. We're still talking about sexuality. And I'm going to go deeply into one of the more fascinating and helpful books. It's a booklet, actually, that I have ever read to help me better understand the very legitimate struggles that many of us are having around gender and sexuality issues and how they are being addressed. So we got the big umbrella LGBTQ IA+, which, of course, is a composite of a lot of different presentations and experiences of people. In this particular booklet that I'm going to be talking about, written by Gregory Prince, he really wants to focus in on the LGB portion of that long acronym. Okay, so the lesbian, gay, bisexual. I want to talk about and riff with you guys today about the science that has been discovered that justifies our concerns. Okay, so the booklet that I am referencing here, and that I'm going to be offering my own thoughts and feelings and opinions on as I go, as per usual. This booklet is called Science versus Dogma. Biology Challenges the LDS Paradigm of Homosexuality. Okay, and so as I mentioned before, we're going to really be focusing today on the LGB of the LGBTQIA plus movement. And next, in the next episode, I'm actually going to broaden that out, and we're going to kind of talk about all of the sexual and gender minorities, because I'm going to do a psychological analysis of Carolyn Pearson's No More Goodbyes book, which I think we should all put our scriptures down for at least a few days or a week or two and just read that book, and it'll change all of our lives forever. At least it changed mine. So not wanting to speak for the group, but I can really proselytize that book all day long as far as the impact it has had on my growing understanding of this very crucial topic. And it's crucial because it hurts people. And if we are hurting people, we need to learn how to not hurt people. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump in to Prince's booklet, Science versus Dogma. Okay, so as I mentioned before, Prince is really locking in on LGB. When you do a good study, you talk about what you're going to talk about, and you also sort of talk about the limits of what you're not going to be addressing. And I want to make clear, as he did, that this is not because these things are not important. It's just simply because he wants to talk about what he did study. These particular scientific studies that he's going to be making reference to have to do with gay men. And the reason why he studied this is because, in his own opinion, the LDS Church has really locked in on and been very, very critical of and sort of demonized the gay male. So he starts out by talking about the prevalence of homosexuality. He, in his own studies, has found that there is a general consensus that between 3.5% and 5% of adults throughout the world self-identify as gay, lesbian, or bisexual. There is no persuasive evidence that the percentage has varied significantly across time and geography. But he also goes on to say, while not representing the majority within a given species, homosexuality is a common phenomenon within the animal kingdom at large. This is a quote, I'm quoting. LDS Apostle Boyd Packer's claims to the contrary notwithstanding when he said without documentation that animals do not pair up with their own gender. Prince goes on to say a well-documented study of sheep showed that given a choice, 8% of rams mated exclusively with other rams. Long-term same-sex pair bonding has been reported in, I'm not going to be able to say this word right, ungulates and in some birds. Okay, something else that I think is important to think about whenever there's a study of this nature, there's the reported statistic, and then you always have to make accounts for the fact that many of that number is going to probably inevitably be lower when the issue is heated and there's shame associated with it culturally. It's going to be an underreported number. Okay, with regards to the prevalence of homosexuality in the animal kingdom, this is a standard reference on the subject of homosexuality in animals published in 1999, documents homosexual behavior in nearly 500 species of animals, with an estimate 7 years later, the number actually went up to 1,500. And then he says, I will leave it to you to ponder why this trait perseveres among such an astonishingly broad array of species. Prince then goes on to sort of talk about the history of at least some of the most significant statements that began to be made in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints regarding homosexuality. And these often, in some ways, followed right along the trajectory of what the culture at large was talking about and what their feelings and experiences were early on. I'm not going to go ahead and quote all of those things, but just in general, we all have a pretty good idea that it was pretty hostile and there was a lot of pathologizing. I'm going to actually go into this a little bit more later, but he just kind of sets the stage for helping us understand the way the church sort of saw, feared, and experienced the homosexual population. And he says this, all of these were done with the best of intentions. Indeed, what intentions could be better than saving a soul from hellfire? And all of these statements were without a shred of scientific evidence to support either choice or social factors such as education or recruitment as causes of homosexuality. So at large, the culture was completely ignorant as to the cause or the origins of homosexuality. And Prince does go on to say, however, that even into the 70s, little was known. Science had very, very little to say in the 1970s about the actual nature of homosexuality. Policy at the church level, and this is not just us, but this is in general, lots of conservative Christianity and throughout the world, actually, policy was informed by dogma, not data. Prince actually goes on to state that when he was getting his doctoral studies degree in pathology at UCLA in 1973 through 75, there was not yet a single graduate course offered to those in the field of molecular biology. And molecular biology has, in fact, been the key to our understanding the nature of and the origins of homosexuality. Okay, so as molecular biology became more and more of a maturing field and gene sequencing became more routine, the hunt for what they call a gay gene was on. The assumption was that homosexuality, like many physical traits such as eye color and hair color, would be determined by one gene. As it has become apparent that there is no gay gene, behavioralists began to decide that it must actually be, in fact, as they supposed beforehand, that it was, in fact, something that was either heritable or that it was something that was based on social factors, education, or recruitment. Okay, back to the quote with Prince. However, he said, there was, in fact, more to be learned as far as homosexuality that was independent of the fact that there was no, and still I believe is no gay gene. He does say, I want to walk you through a summary of how science has informed us about homosexuality. I do this as a scientist who has spent over 4 decades in biomedical research. I'm quoting Prince here. This is not me. I'm not a researcher in biomedical research, as you well know. Okay, back to the quote. Bear in mind that what I do will describe this as an ongoing journey and not a destination. This is very much an interim report that he's talking about here in this booklet. He also says that his belief is that the arc of science is long and it bends towards truth, which I love that quote. Okay, so we're going to start by talking about how is homosexuality connected to genetics. Okay, I'm going to define what genetics is. This is just I grabbed from Google. Genetics is the study of heredity and the variation of inherited characteristics. Okay, so I'm going to go back to Prince and what he says in the booklet here. He says, a man by the name of Dean Hamer, a pioneer in molecular biology of sexuality, did not find the gay gene that he sought, but he did find that gay brothers had an increased probability of sharing markers on the XQ28 region of the X chromosome. While not identifying a single cause underlying male homosexuality, Hamer's work, which has been confirmed broadly by other laboratories, provides strong evidence of a contribution of a certain gene, the XQ28. And hence, there is, in fact, a correlation between homosexuality and one's genetics. Okay, more recent studies have shown that an additional marker, this one is on chromosome 8, is shared between homosexual brothers at a rate significantly higher than between straight brothers. Okay, I'm going to close the quote here for just a second and talk to you guys about this. What this study is showing is that while it's not as simple as there being a certain gene, if you have this gene, then you're going to be homosexual. And if you don't, then you're not. They are actually showing tight correlations between certain patterns, certain markers on a certain chromosome, in this case, chromosome 8, or shared markers on the X chromosome. So they're definitely saying there is absolute correlation and there is connection, at least. I hate to sort of talk about whether it's cause or correlation, but what they're basically saying is that there is, in fact, some connection between one's genetics and one's gayness. Okay, back to the quote. Before molecular biology came of age, family studies, wherein homosexuality clusters in certain families, and twinning studies pointed towards a significant, although not a decisive role in genetics. So twin studies are particularly compelling. This is where they take two twins and they study them and see how they are similar and how they're different. Okay, so he goes on to say there are two types of twins. Identical twins have identical DNA sequences, but while fraternal twins have variable percentages of DNA sequences with each other. So they're not identical, obviously. If genetics were the only factor underlying homosexuality, then one would expect 100% concordance between identical twins. That is, both twins would be either heterosexual or homosexual. If genetics were not a factor at all, one would expect the same concordance among fraternal twins as among identical twins, since fraternal twins develop in the utero environment. In fact, the numbers fall between the two extremes. The concordance amongst identical twins is, in fact, up to 60%. But amongst fraternal twins, being homosexual really is only correlated by about 15%. Therefore, there is strong evidence that while genetics is a factor, it is not the only factor that determines sexual orientation. Okay, then we're going to go on to another part, which is a separate whole thing that is called epigenetics. Okay, so I'm going to describe to you a little bit about what epigenetics is. So I just finished talking to you about two factors that the research has shown makes genetic connection with homosexuality. Now we're going to talk about epigenetics. Okay, so epigenetics, for those of you who are wanting, to really understand this, it's different than genetics. Remember, genetics is the study of heredity and the variation of inherited characteristics. So if we were just talking about genetics, it's just something that's inherited from generation to generation. Now, if you move into the field of epigenetics, this is a newer field. This is the study of changes in organisms caused by modification of gene expression, okay, rather than alterations of the genetic code itself. I'm going to go ahead and repeat that because I think it kind of is a little bit of a complex phenomenon. I know when I was learning all about epigenetics, it took me a few times to sort of make sense of it. So genetics is simply inherited characteristics, just how your gene is coded. Epigenetics means that in the process of organisms growing and developing, sometimes genes are modified and they're expressed differently. The very best way I came to understand this when I was personally learning about epigenetics was that sometimes the genetic code is the same, but certain things are expressed differently. Or in other words, there may be a metaphorical switch that's flipped that causes the genetic code to behave differently, even though the code itself is the same. Okay, so the gene is the same, but the way it expresses itself in one's lived experience is in fact different. Okay, so let's just have some fun and talk a little bit about how they have come to discover through science that epigenetics does in fact play a large part in one's homosexuality. Okay, I'm going to go back to Prince. He says this is so interesting, you guys. Okay, so just hold on tight. This is fascinating. The first way that epigenetics expresses itself in gayness is this. Okay, he says this. The first is a birth order effect, which seems to be only apparent in males. It is estimated that 15 to 28% of gay men owe their sexual orientation to birth order. While the mechanism is not completely understood, it appears to be due to interactions between the male fetus and his mother's immune system that have increased consequences for each subsequent male birth. Okay, so I'm hoping you're picking up on, I'm closing the quote here and I'm talking to you directly, is that this male child is not in this case genetically gay, but because of what happens between the male in utero and as he reacts to his mother's immune system, that child can have an increased probability of being gay the later on he is in birth order. Okay, back to the quote. After the birth of one son, the likelihood of each subsequent son of the same biological mother being gay increases by 33%. Okay, so check out these numbers though. If the likelihood of the first is 3%, then that of the second would be 4%. The effect is additive, such that the seventh son would have a 17% chance of being gay. Daughters do not experience a similar phenomenon, nor is the effect on sons influenced by the number of older sisters. So this is only if there are multiple boys. Back to the quote, the only effect is true and this is crazy, you guys, check this out. And the effect is only true for right-handed sons. Prince himself says, who knew that this could be so complicated? So what you're probably picking up on is whether it's causation, correlation, they're noticing that there is definitely a consistency here where some in utero, there is something that happens that flips on, or that there's an interaction between the mother in utero and later born sons, especially when they have older, or particularly when they have older brothers. Okay. Another example of epigenetic impact and how gayness can be impacted by or is connected to epigenetics, or something that is how gene expression is changed before a child is born, is this. Back to Prince, he says this. Another example is probably more important in causing homosexuality. It is called, quote, epigenetically, canalized sexual development. In plainer English, gosh, you could have just said the plainer English first, right? In plainer English, at the very early stage of fetal development, epigenetic factors that are not part of the DNA, but can be passed from either parent to the fetus, affect the way the sex of the fetal brain is developed. Okay, so once again, okay, so another example of how epigenetics can impact homosexuality is as follows. This is Prince. Another example is probably more important in causing homosexuality. It is called epigenetically canalized sexual development. In plainer English, at the very early stage of fetal development, epigenetic factors that are not part of the DNA can be passed from either parent to the fetus, affect the way the sex of the fetal brain is imprinted. Okay, what that means is this. This is Prince talking. Testosterone is present in all developing fetuses, but at higher levels in some males. But in order for testosterone to exert its effect in imprinting maleness into the fetal brain, there must be a receptor for it within that brain. Okay, so I want you to think about this, guys. I'm not quoting, I'm talking myself to you now. So what they're talking about is there is so testosterone is a hormone, and for testosterone to be effective, there has to be what is called a receptor. And basically, the way I like to think about this is if you have testosterone is like the vehicle and the receptor is like the parking lot, there has to be somewhere for the testosterone to park itself. It has to be able to land somewhere. Okay. Back to the quote. Generally, male fetuses have higher levels of testosterone and higher levels of testosterone receptors. So there's lots of cars and there are lots of parking spaces for males. They have more testosterone and they have more receptors. Back to the quote. While females have lower levels of testosterone and lower levels of testosterone receptors. That's what makes males more masculine and females more feminine. Okay, back to the quote. In some instances, however, there is a mismatch that is determined by an epigenetic factor inherited from a parent. So what we're saying here, you guys, is their genetics are not different, but based on something that goes on in utero, sometimes there is a mismatch between testosterone, the testosterone chemical, and the receptors. So there is sometimes not enough places to park the testosterone in the male brain, or sometimes there can be a mismatch in the other direction. Okay, back to the quote. This is Prince speaking. This can result in male embryos with lower levels of receptors, in which case testosterone cannot fully exert its masculinizing effect on the brain. So the testosterone is there, but there's nowhere for it to park itself so that it can have male expression, or it can develop more masculine expression in the uterus, in the brain of this developing uterus. I'm sorry, in the brain of the developing fetus. My goodness, that took me a second to get out. Okay, back to the quote. Alternatively, female embryos can have high levels of receptors, in which case even a normally low testosterone levels that circulate within the blood of female fetuses are preferentially grabbed by those receptors and allowed to exert a masculinizing effect on the brain. Okay, so I'm going to just sum this up for you guys. Testosterone has a massive impact on masculinity, and if the male brain has all these, stay with my metaphor here, you guys. If the male brain has a lot of testosterone vehicles, but the parking lot is full, the car drives off, and there's not going to be as much masculinity expressed in the developing brain of that fetus. On the flip side, if there are extra receptor sites in the little brain of the developing female, these receptor sites actually look for and grab more testosterone. And conceivably, what he's basically getting at here, to stay with my metaphor, is the parking lot tries to fill itself up. And so the body actually looks for more testosterone to fill the parking lot up. And so that's how a woman or a small female fetus is going to actually have extra masculine characteristics forming in their little brain even before this female child is born. Okay, I'm going to go back to the quote here. All of the brain's imprinting occurs prenatally. At the time of puberty, when testosterone or estrogen levels begin to spike, the imprinted brain is impervious to this effect, meaning that you can't impact this. This has already been happening. It started happening in utero. Okay, so you can't impact this. You can't change it. In other words, back to the quote, in other words, the female with a fetal masculinized brain will be sexually oriented towards women, while a male with a fetal masculinized brain, with a fetal feminized brain, will be sexually oriented towards men. Hormones and hormone therapy notwithstanding. Close quote. What Prince is trying to communicate here is that there are ways to make sense of, from a scientific paradigm, that children are born homosexual. It has to do with genetic factors, the two that were described at the very beginning. And then it also has to do with epigenetic factors, which means there is an impact, that there's something that happens between the brain development of the baby and its relationship with his or her mother in utero, that creates the brain of that little child, this prenatal child, that then will move into development in their later years in life and will impact who and how their brain maps sexual attraction. This is what happens. It's happened before they were born. There's nothing that you can do necessarily to change this. This is a scientific fact. So Prince closes this section by saying this: the genesis of sexual orientation is an area of science that is undergoing much cutting edge research, and it is certain that future discoveries will elucidate more examples of homosexuality being biologically determined, whether through genetics, epigenetics, or through a combination of these. But the bottom line has already been written. Homosexuals are indeed born that way. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and just pause right now because I want to just reflect with you guys how important this information is for our church and for our world at large. Maybe before the 1970s, when we didn't know, we had less of an excuse. I'm inclined to think we never have an excuse truly to marginalize minority populations of any kind. And yet here we are, and we struggle with this mightily as a world. And yet, as science catches up with these cultural norms, it is so incredibly important that we regard science and that we honor science, and we find it and we experience science as something that is sacred, that teaches us how these things are, why they are, and it helps us actually, in fact, better love people more fully. I mean, there's never a reason to not love them, but now we actually have science backing that doctrine. Okay, I want to jump over to church dogma and how the church has experienced and talked about and continues to talk about homosexuality. Okay, so here we go. The earliest, this is back to the booklet, the earliest church-written guide for ecclesiastical leaders, published in 1973, chided professionally trained people who differed among themselves in their opinions regarding the cause of homosexuality, whereas, quote, the gospel makes this issue clear: homosexuality is a learned behavior, not inborn. General church officers, most notably Apostle Boyd K. Packer, were even more forceful in denouncing any notion of a biological basis. This is a quote by Packer. He says this: there is a falsehood that some are born with an attraction to their own kind, with nothing they can do about it. They are just that way and can only yield to these desires. This is a malicious and destructive lie. While it is a convincing idea to some, it is of the devil. No one is locked into that kind of life. Okay, Prince goes on to report this. He says this: if, as the sources claimed, biology is not the source, then what is? LDS church leaders have, over a century, posited a creative array of causes, the first being, of all things, monogamy. And the reason why they reported this was because this was a time when they were attempting to justify polygamy. So back in the day, according to Prince's research, the thing that caused homosexuality was, in fact, monogamy. All right, back to the quote. Others included contagion, satanic influences, pornography, curiosity, and proselytizing. None was tempered by uncertainty. And I think what he means by that is that nobody ever paused to question the possibility or the probability that maybe it was none of those things. And maybe somebody was, in fact, genetically or epigenetically, they were born that way. Okay. Then Prince goes on to say the aversion to the biological explanation of homosexuality is common among other conservative religious traditions, which justify their sin-based viewpoint by a highly selective reading of biblical verses. However, Mormons' construct of homosexuality as wrong or bad or sinful is more nuanced. President Spencer W. Kimball wrote, quote, to believe that immoral behavior is inborn or hereditary is to deny that men have agency to choose between sin and righteousness. It is inconceivable, as some involved in homosexual behavior claim, he could permit some of his children to be born with desires and inclinations which would require behavior contrary to the eternal plan. Okay, so what Kimball here is saying, and of course what Packard said later, is that there is no possible way that this is something that's inborn or something that could even be seen as neutral because of their understanding of the plan of salvation. And of course, they also are part of a larger culture. They're part of a culture at large, which has in general, and struggled in general forever in acknowledging that there is a minority population that is in a very neutral way same gender attracted. I'm going to go into this a little bit more later, but one of the other reasons why our struggles in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is more nuanced than conservative Christianity, evangelical and Protestant Christianity, is because of our own doctrine around the eternal nature of gender and family. Prince goes on to say this: yet another explanation derives from the Latter-day Saint belief that one's identity, including gender, began prior to birth, that is, spirit beings in a premortal state bore the identity that they would have later on as physical personages and would remain unaltered in postmortal resurrected state. Now, that opens up a whole nother large conversation. If you guys really want to go deeply into this, I would invite you to run, don't walk, to listen or read Taylor Petry's book, Tabernacles of Clay. It is a very deep dive. It's a complex book, very, very good one, that talks about the origins and history and the very much changing history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints understanding of premortal gender and how it impacts us today, and how it's still being sort of made sense of, and how it's changed over the years, a lot of times. Okay, then Prince goes on to say, using again as a startling point the assumption that homosexuality is inherently sinful, this exercise in circular reasoning goes on to conclude that God is incapable of making a mistake that would place a person into a sinful state because of biological imprinting, and therefore that there could be no biological basis for homosexuality. Boyd Packard gave this explanation in 1976, quote, from our premortal life, we were directed into a physical body. There is no mismatching of bodies and spirits. Boys will become men, masculine, manly men, and ultimately become fathers and husbands. Okay, let me just visit with you guys for a second about this whole idea. What we're going to go deeper into as this podcast episode moves on is that the church has, in fact, painted itself into a bit of a corner, because if we are going to rigidly hold on to the sort of dogmas of the nature of the plan of salvation and eternal life, there is, in fact, no room for homosexuality. Certainly, if that is not allowed, if that is considered wicked or sinful, then we, in the postmortal life, then we, of course, have to condemn these folks. Now, the problem is, science has moved forward and progressed enough to teach us that people are, in fact, born homosexual. And therefore, what is called for at this point in time is a lot of psychological and emotional maturity in individuals and as institutions to then start really questioning the doctrine. Because if someone is born that way, the God that I worship is not going to give someone a physical body and a physical experience and then say that there is something innately wrong with what it means for them to have their human experience. So therefore, the problem can't be with the individual. It must, in fact, be with the dogma or the doctrine.